There are moments in life that split everything into two, what happened before and what came after. That afternoon, which started like any other day, turned into one of those moments for me. It was supposed to be ordinary, but it ended up changing everything. I was home alone, as usual, since my husband, Ethan, was off on yet another business trip. His constant absence usually left me feeling lonely, but this time, I saw a tiny upside to it. For once, I had a little space to myself, something I rarely got anymore. Over the years, I'd gotten so used to putting everyone else first that even the idea of being alone felt like a luxury. Ethan's indifference had worn me down, and these quiet moments had become something I secretly looked forward to. That afternoon felt like a rare gift, a chance to breathe. I'd retreated to my bedroom, my safe haven. The soft sheets I'd picked out years ago wrapped around me like a cocoon, and I'd set up my laptop, surrounded by my little comforts. These quiet times weren't unusual when Ethan was away, especially back when his son, Mason, was away at college. But now that Mason was back home, those moments of peace were hard to come by. With his tall, commanding presence always around, it felt like I could never truly be alone. Thinking about Mason brought back memories of the first time I met him. He was tall, athletic, with sharp features and this intense stare that caught me off guard. It was unsettling, but I pushed the thought aside. Just a passing observation, nothing more. That afternoon, though, I knew Mason was out with his friends and wouldn't be back until later. It gave me a sense of freedom, a chance to unwind without worrying about anyone else. I thought I'd closed the door securely, but I must have been careless because it wasn't fully latched. I was just starting to relax, sinking into the comfort of my solitude, when the door swung open. Mason walked in, and the look on his face, I'll never forget it. Our eyes locked, and for a few seconds, it felt like time stopped. My first instinct was to hide what I was doing, but it was too late. The sounds from my laptop filled the room, and I saw Mason's eyes widen. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion, and then to something else, something I couldn't quite place. Curiosity? Intrigue? Whatever it was, it sent a jolt through me. I froze, completely exposed. There was no way to cover up, no way to stop the noise, no way to escape the humiliation. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Mason's face, that mix of shock and something deeper, is burned into my memory. It was a moment I couldn't take back, no matter how much I wanted to. I guess I should have knocked, Mason stammered, his voice shaky but deep. He started backing away slowly, his eyes still locked on me, like he couldn't look away. Then, with a soft click, the door closed, and I was alone again. But something had changed. Something dangerous, forbidden, and yet, strangely irresistible. I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in my hands, my whole body trembling. What had just happened? I'm a 42-year-old woman, and my stepson had just seen me in a way I never wanted him to. My mind kept replaying the look in his eyes, over and over, each time sending a wave of heat through me. It wasn't just shame I felt, there was something else, something I couldn't ignore. That look in Mason's eyes, it wasn't just surprise. There was something more, something deeper. It was like he saw something in me, something he wanted. The thought was wrong, disgusting even, but I couldn't shake it. My heart raced, my breath quickened, and that strange feeling inside me wasn't just embarrassment, it was something else entirely. I'd noticed the way Mason looked at me before, the way his eyes lingered a little too long, the subtle hints of interest. But I'd always told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into it. Until today. Today, everything felt different. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. 3 days, I thought to myself. 3 days with Ethan away, just me and Mason in the house. I didn't know how I was going to handle this tension between us. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a thrill I couldn't deny. It was wrong, dangerous, but impossible to ignore. Part of me hoped it would just fade away, that it would be a one-time thing we'd both forget. But deep down, I knew better. Narrator comment asterisk. You know, looking back, it's funny how one careless moment can change everything. That afternoon was supposed to be just another quiet day, but it ended up being the start of something I couldn't control. Funny how life works, isn't it? But I had no clue how wrong I was. No idea what was coming next. The next day would turn out to be something I never saw coming, and before I knew it, I'd be on a path there was no turning back from. At the time, though, I had no way of knowing just how far I'd fall into this mess. I didn't see Mason at all that day. The house felt unnaturally quiet, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, weighed down by what had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the one that had shattered whatever normalcy we'd had before. The next day dragged on in silence. Mason stayed holed up in his room, and after throwing together a quick meal in the kitchen, I retreated to the living room. It was like we'd made some unspoken pact to avoid each other, to pretend nothing had happened. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, and even though neither of us said a word, we both felt it. By evening, I couldn't sit still anymore. I decided to take a shower, hoping the warm water would wash away the thoughts that had been haunting me. As the water ran over me, I tried to focus on the sensation, to push the memory of Mason's shocked, intense expression out of my mind. But it kept coming back, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then, out of nowhere, the power went out. The bathroom plunged into complete darkness, and my heart jumped into my throat. The water kept running, but everything else was silent and pitch black. For a second, I just stood there, frozen, not sure what to do. Then I quickly turned off the shower, wrapped myself in a robe, and tied it tight, my hands shaking the whole time. Just as I finished, I heard Mason's voice from the hallway. "Emma, are you okay?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with concern. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice trembling. "I think the power's out." I tightened the belt of my robe and walked toward the sound of his voice. When I reached the kitchen, I couldn't see him, but I could hear his footsteps. "We need to find a candle," he said, his voice slightly tense. The faint glow from a streetlight outside barely lit one corner of the kitchen, but the rest of the room was swallowed by shadows. As we both fumbled around, I suddenly bumped into him. My shoulder hit his chest, and we both froze, holding our breath. His hands instinctively went to my waist, steadying me so I wouldn't fall. But that touch, it wasn't just a reflex. "Sorry, I didn't see you," Mason said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Our eyes met in the dim light filtering in from outside, and in that moment, the pull between us was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. "It's okay," I murmured, my voice shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Mason's eyes flickered to my lips, his breath brushing against my face, and the space between us seemed to vanish. "Emma," he said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. I didn't want to pull away. In that moment, every boundary I'd ever held on to just melted. Then, suddenly, the lights came back on. We both jumped back like we'd been caught. Mason moved toward the breaker box, pretending to check it, but I knew neither of us could shake what had just happened. When I returned to the living room, Mason followed. His gaze was still locked on me, but this time, there was a determination in his eyes. "Emma, we need to talk," he said. The tone of his voice told me this wasn't going to be some casual conversation. My heart started racing again as I sat across from him. The tension in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. We both knew this conversation had been coming for a while now. There was no denying it, nothing would ever be the same. Mason looked down, speaking softly. "Emma, I'm sorry about yesterday. If I made you uncomfortable, it wasn't intentional. When I saw the door open, I shouldn't have looked." His voice trailed off as he searched for the right words. "I'm just embarrassed," I said, though my voice wavered. "But I don't blame you. Really, it's just, everything in this house has felt so off lately." Mason lifted his head, his eyes locking with mine. "You're not what's off, Emma. What's off is Ethan, him being so distant, never here for you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been trying to ignore how little Ethan cared, but hearing Mason say it out loud broke something inside me. "It doesn't matter," I said quietly, though I didn't even believe my own words. Mason sighed and leaned closer. "Yes, it does. It's impossible not to notice, Emma. You feel lonely, and that's not your fault." Tears welled up in my eyes. Hearing my loneliness put into words so plainly left me defenseless. "I thought I'd gotten used to it," I murmured, but the warmth in Mason's gaze pushed me to keep going. "But sometimes, it feels so overwhelming. I don't know what to do." When Mason placed his hand over mine, my breath caught. "You shouldn't have to feel lonely, Emma," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Someone like you shouldn't feel this way." For a moment, I lost myself in the weight of his touch. Then I looked up at his face and saw the sincerity in his eyes. That's when I realized this wasn't just some fleeting attraction. Mason was serious. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. "I want to talk about Carly," I said, my voice steadier now. "You said you broke up, but why?" Mason hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Because I haven't felt anything for her in a long time," he said. "That relationship was over, I just couldn't admit it." I studied his face carefully. "Then why now? Why did you decide to end it now?" For a moment, Mason looked away, then met my eyes again. We were so close I could feel his breath. "Because I like you, Emma," he said, his voice low but clear. "Carly didn't matter anymore. You've been on my mind. It's been like this for a while, and that's why I ended it." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. In that moment, Mason gently placed his hands on my waist and pulled me closer. Our lips were just inches apart, and I realized this wasn't just some passing thing. This was real. Narrator comment asterisk. Looking back, it's crazy how one moment can change everything. That night in the kitchen, with the power out and the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife, I knew things would never be the same. But I had no idea just how far it would go. This was a step we couldn't take back. When Mason's lips finally met mine, it felt like time had stopped. His warmth, his confidence, and the magnetic pull I felt toward him completely consumed me. My heart was racing, and my mind went blank. There was nothing but this moment, here and now, with him. At some point, the intensity of my emotions pushed me to act. I slowly broke the kiss, pulling back slightly to catch my breath. Looking into his eyes, I whispered, I've been drawn to you for a while now, Mason." As the words left my lips, it felt like every wall between us had crumbled. A moment of silence passed between us. That silence was critical, a pause where we both questioned just how far we were willing to go. I locked eyes with him, took a deep breath, and stood up. He looked surprised, but there was a flicker of desire in his eyes. "I can't bear this loneliness anymore," I said, my voice steady but firm. I'd been holding myself back for so long that stopping now felt pointless. Mason's gaze was fixed on me, intense and unwavering. Slowly, I untied the belt of my robe, feeling the fabric slide off my shoulders and pool at my feet. His eyes followed every movement, locked onto me as the robe fell away. Without a word, I walked over to the large couch in the living room. Gently, I let myself sink into the soft cushions, reclining as my body stretched across the couch. Mason didn't hesitate. One by one, he removed his clothes, placing them aside. Every motion felt deliberate, like he was defying time itself, moving inevitably toward what couldn't be stopped. One of his knees rested on the couch beside me, his hands gripping the cushions on either side of my body as he leaned over me. I could feel his breath on my skin, that warmth coursing through me like an electric current. When our eyes met, his lips slowly found mine. That kiss wasn't just a kiss, it was an explosion of every suppressed emotion, every forbidden thought, every yearning born out of loneliness. Mason's hand slid gently to my waist, his touch both tender and decisive. I kept my gaze fixed on him, unable to look away. In that fleeting moment, something stirred within me, something I hadn't even realized I'd forgotten. The more Mason spoke, the deeper I was drawn to him. With each passing second, I found myself liking him more and more. It didn't take long for my body to begin trembling uncontrollably, and as I closed my eyes, a loud, almost desperate sound escaped from deep within me. When I finally opened my eyes again, I was overwhelmed by the sight of Mason's broad, powerful shoulders. I instinctively placed my hands on his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. His face was flushed, his breath shallow, and in that moment, we were both consumed by the intensity of what we were experiencing. I was completely lost in the sensation. Mason, too, seemed caught in the moment, his face radiating joy and passion. Just when I thought I couldn't feel any more alive, my body trembled again, an uncontrollable shiver running through me. Without thinking, I dug my nails into his back, my grip tightening. I could feel him respond, his body relaxing into the sensation, and I knew he was just as lost in the moment as I was. A warmth blossomed inside me, a feeling of contentment unlike anything I'd ever known. It was wonderful, simply, inexplicably wonderful. Every moment I spent with Mason was a strange mix of excitement and unease. There was something about it that thrilled me to my core, yet unsettled me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. With Ethan still days away from returning, Mason and I continued to share passionate, boundary-pushing moments that seemed to unfold effortlessly. The line between right and wrong blurred, fading into the background as our connection deepened. It felt like everything we did was inevitable, as if it was meant to happen, and the guilt, the wrongness, was something I pushed into the farthest corners of my mind, refusing to acknowledge it. Mason's presence began to fill the empty space left by Ethan's indifference, and I could feel myself coming alive again. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. But when Ethan finally returned, his cold indifference was unchanged. The distance between us only grew, and the loneliness I'd felt during his absence, paired with the warmth and intimacy I'd experienced with Mason, made the chasm between Ethan and me feel impossible to bridge. Even with Ethan back in the picture, Mason and I continued to text each other, our conversations filling a space in my life that I simply couldn't ignore. It was a connection I craved, a spark that kept me going, even when Ethan was right there beside me. One evening, Ethan casually mentioned he had a work meeting and wouldn't be home for the night. I couldn't suppress the thrill that surged within me at the thought of having the night to myself, the night to share with Mason. I grabbed my phone almost reflexively, my fingers moving quickly as I typed, Ethan isn't home tonight. It's just us. I can't wait to see you, I paused for a few seconds, my finger hovering over the send button. My heart was pounding so loudly I could feel it in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment longer, unsure, but then I pressed the button, sending the message into the world. I set my phone down on the table with a sigh of relief, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips as I thought about the night ahead, the possibilities, the excitement, the unknown. Little did I know, the world was unfolding in a very different way elsewhere, and the consequences of my actions would soon intertwine with events I had no idea were happening at that very moment. Mason was facing a confrontation he'd been dreading. There, in the dimly lit apartment, he stood in front of Carly, his ex-girlfriend, who had been an ever-present, suffocating shadow in his life for months. Her obsession with him had reached unbearable levels, and tonight, Mason had finally decided that enough was enough. He had no choice but to confront her, to put an end to it. Carly, however, wasn't willing to let go so easily. Her eyes burned with determination and a desire for vengeance. She cut him off repeatedly, her words sharp and loaded with anger. Carly, that's enough, Mason said, his voice a mix of firmness and exhaustion, the weight of the situation evident in every syllable. Stay out of my life. I don't want you anymore. Just as he spoke, his phone buzzed on the table, vibrating slightly. Carly's gaze flicked to the screen, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Narrator comment asterisk. Isn't it funny how one decision can set off a chain reaction? That text I sent, it felt like a small thing at the time, just a moment of excitement. But little did I know, it was about to change everything. The fake, mocking smile on Carly's face vanished, replaced by something much darker. I knew it, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. I saw you two together. Mason, caught off guard, stepped forward to grab his phone, but Carly was faster. She snatched it up, clutching it like a weapon, her expression twisted with rage. I'll tell Ethan everything, she spat, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Her eyes burned with a fire Mason had never seen before. I've been watching you. I know everything. Mason's heart sank as the weight of the situation hit him. This was spiraling out of control, and he could feel the chaos closing in. There was no way this was going to end well. Later that evening, when Mason and I talked, he sounded exhausted but determined. I confronted her yesterday, he began, his voice steady but edged with frustration. Nothing happened. I just told her to stay out of my life. She's been obsessed for months, but I made it clear it's over. His words gave me a sliver of relief, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. Something felt off, like a storm brewing on the horizon, and I wasn't ready for what was coming. The next morning, Ethan's behavior changed completely. From the moment we sat down for breakfast, his attitude toward me was intense, almost suffocating. The man who had always been distant and cold was suddenly everywhere I turned, his gaze following me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He asked questions that seemed innocent enough, but his tone carried an edge, something accusatory, almost probing. Are you okay, Emma? He asked, his eyes locking onto mine. Has something been going on lately? There was a subtle sharpness to his voice, a hint of suspicion that made my stomach twist. His gaze felt like it could pierce through me, straight into the secrets I was desperately trying to hide. I tried to brush it off, but the doubt in his eyes only grew as the day went on, leaving me more anxious with every passing hour. By evening, the tension was unbearable. I felt trapped, like I was caught in a web I hadn't even seen coming. Desperate, I sent Mason a message, Ethan's acting so strange. It feels like he's onto something. I'm scared, the moment I hit send, the doorbell rang, sharp and sudden. I froze, my heart pounding with dread. Ethan opened the door, and Carly's voice cut through the silence like a knife. My breath caught as my eyes darted toward the hallway. And there she was, Carly. Her face was twisted into a sly, knowing smile, and her eyes flicked between Ethan and Mason with a chilling glint. There was something terrifying in her gaze, something that made my stomach churn. She knew. And she was ready to use it. In that moment, every fear I'd been carrying seemed to come crashing down. Ethan, still oblivious to the tension, asked, his voice laced with confusion, "Carly, what are you doing here?" His words hung in the air, like he hadn't yet grasped the gravity of what was happening. Carly, however, didn't look away. Her gaze was steady, calculating, as if this moment had been rehearsed 1,000 times. With a deliberate, almost theatrical pause, she finally spoke, her voice smooth and dripping with mockery. "Hello, Emma," she said, her words slicing through the room like a blade. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten, like she could see straight through me, exposing every secret I'd tried to bury. For a split second, I couldn't breathe. She glanced at Mason, barely acknowledging him, before turning back to me, her grin widening into something far too knowing. "Looks like we've got a lot to talk about," she added, her smile teetering on the edge of arrogance and menace. And in that instant, something inside me shattered. A wave of terror crashed over me, and my mind raced with disjointed thoughts. What does she know? What is she going to say? Will she tell Ethan everything? Is this where it all falls apart? My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stole a glance at Mason, whose face mirrored my own rising panic. But the most terrifying thing in the room wasn't the fear in Mason's eyes or the confusion on Ethan's face. It was Carly's calm, chilling smile. Her composure, so eerily confident, sent a shiver down my spine. And in that moment, I realized, this was just the beginning. The story isn't over. Not even close. What's coming next will take you places you never expected. If you've made it this far, I know you're hooked. There's so much more to unravel, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single twist. Hit that follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment about what you think will happen next. You won't regret it. Narrator comment *. You ever have one of those moments where you just know everything's about to blow up in your face? Yeah, this was one of those. Carly's smile, it wasn't just a smile. It was a warning. And I knew, deep down, this was only the start of the storm.